Time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Dahr Jamail. Dahr Jamail is an independent journalist who has covered the Middle East for more than 4 years. He has reported extensively from inside Iraq and also has reported from Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. He writes for Interpress Service, the Asia Times, and many other outlets. His reports have been published in The Nation, The Sunday Herald, The Guardian, Foreign Policy in Focus, and The Independent. He has reported for Democracy Now! And numerous other radio and television and is a special correspondent for Flashpoints, KPFK Radio Pacifica. And he is here to talk about his new book, Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq. If you would begin, start out and tell us what was the motivation in writing your book, Beyond the Green Zone?
I really didn't have plans to write a book, and then basically what happened was after spending 8 months in Iraq over 4 different trips, I had loads and loads of material because not just all the hard news stories that I'd worked on, but I had tons of blogs and then lots of personal notes that had never been published anywhere. And it was summer of 2005. I hadn't been in Iraq for a while. It'd been a few months, but I met Anthony Arnove with Haymarket Books at a conference, and he asked me to stop by his office and said, "Hey, we'd love to do your book." And I was like, "My book? What? There is no book." He said, "Oh, yes, there is." And so that got the ball rolling, and we worked together. He edited my book, and I basically went through and pulled together. I went chronologically through my time in Iraq of why did I go and then what I saw as I was there over a pretty long period of time, because it was 4 different trips between November '03 and February '05. And so it's basically a first-person narrative of my time. I try to make it pretty personal and to show primarily the Iraqi voices in their stories. But also it's a bit of an assault on the mainstream media because I compare, one of the main themes of the book is I compare what I saw on the ground to how it was reported back here.
So how is it that, for the people unfamiliar with your story, how is it that you became a journalist in Iraq in the first place?
Well, the short version of the story is I was living up in Anchorage, Alaska, spending my summers as a mountain guide and then a volunteer rescue ranger on Denali, and doing some freelance journalism on the side. And basically I was watching the mainstream media reportage on the build-up to the war, the selling of the war to the American people. And I was comparing that to the facts, to the UN weapons inspectors' reports, to what was being reported in other media outlets, a bit more trustworthy overseas, like The Independent and Le Monde, for example. And it was like I was watching 2 different stories, and I was kind of baffled that here we are watching our mainstream media be very complicit with an administration in selling a war to the American people based on lies. And I was completely outraged. I didn't know what to do, and I decided, you know, I'm gonna go see for myself and write about what I see. I'm gonna go for one trip, and when the money runs out, I'll come home, and hopefully I'll be able to sleep a little bit better at night.
And what did you find when you got there? Was it even worse than what you'd expected?
It was. I had read everything I could get my hands on about the situation. I was reading Robert Fisk. I was reading all other reporters that I trusted that were in there reporting, so I didn't expect a good scene. I mean, I knew that there wasn't going to be much reconstruction happening. I knew that already a resistance had started, but nothing prepared me for driving into Baghdad that first time. It was November '03, and just the total chaos of no reconstruction to be found anywhere. Buildings, all these buildings had been bombed. It looked like they may as well have been bombed yesterday. Huge tanks rolling down the middle of roads, horrible, horrible traffic jams, and you know, even half the traffic lights already at that time weren't working because there was no electricity. So I was blown away that here we were 7 months into the occupation, and already things were really in a pretty deep state of chaos.
And one more question on the mechanics of things. So how did you connect up with people in Iraq? I mean, how does a mountain guide from Alaska, you know, get interviews?
Well, I found my way into the country by basically monitoring the indie media website in Beirut, and I found one of their members who was in Baghdad writing. And so I wrote him an email, and he basically gave me a rough instructions on how to get into the country. So which hotel to go to, how to get into Baghdad, which hotel in Baghdad. in a couple of contacts. And so that got the ball rolling for me. I basically just started following his outline, and I got in. And the hotel I stayed at was a hotel full of a lot of foreign and some independent journalists. And so we started teaming up and working together, sharing interpreters, et cetera. And it was at that hotel that I met a man named Harb, and he became my main interpreter. And we just really got along from the beginning and started working together, and he was a fantastic interpreter and just made stuff happen and got stuff done. And so I stuck with him and, you know, a little bit at times with other people when he wasn't available, but stuck with him through all the next 8 months, basically, all my different trips in Iraq. And he became integral to my work because, especially in a place like Iraq, as chaotic and violent as it became, having a really, really good and trustworthy interpreter and fixer was your lifeblood.
Now, you have actually been to Fallujah. I'm wondering if you can tell us about that and how you chose to go there in the first place.
I had been into Fallujah several times before the first siege in April 2004 started. I had been in there and interviewed people and been in there when the entire city was under collective punishment from the U.S. military because it became a very volatile spot for the resistance because the Americans basically played a key role in helping start the resistance in Fallujah because it was just a few weeks after Baghdad fell. U.S. soldiers were occupying a school in Fallujah. Families of the kids demonstrated outside of the school because they wanted their kids to be able to use it the next day. And they were fired upon and 17 people were killed. And that was in late April '03. And so thus the resistance was born in Fallujah. And so that set the stage for, of course, the 4 Blackwater mercenaries being killed on March 31st, '04. Of course, the mainstream media didn't report the fact that there were stories coming out of Fallujah for several months that mercenaries were going around in the city and carrying out abductions and executions and sniping and this sort of thing. So what happened to their bodies, the horrible things that were done to their bodies, it also wasn't reported that action was staunchly denounced by the religious leaders of the city. They even told the U.S. commander in charge of the area that if you give us time, we'll bring these people to you. We don't want these people in our city. That type of behavior is against Islam. But nevertheless, the siege was launched. It needs to be made clear that order came directly from the White House. And the city was attacked very brutally in April. 736 people were killed when I went back in May and talked with doctors at Fallujah General Hospital, and they said that probably 60% of them were civilians. And then that led into a period of 6 months where the city was unoccupied, but that also had set the stage for another full-scale invasion of the city. So in November '04, a huge invasion was launched, and at the end of the day, well over 100 U.S. soldiers were killed, and roughly 5,000 Iraqis were killed in that siege. And to this day, 70% of the city remains destroyed, and entire neighborhoods from that period of November '04 to now, they still have not had water and electricity.
And I understand at the time you were reporting, I believe in November 2004, that the U.S. was using things like white phosphorus.
That's correct. I couldn't get into the city for the November siege, so I covered it by interviewing refugees and doctors who were coming out. The military wasn't letting any journalists into the city at all. And so the people I was interviewing, at one point it was roughly 10 days into the siege, so it was around the middle part of November. I started running into a lot of different people coming out of different parts of the city at different times, and they were all telling the same story, talking about these incendiary weapons that when they hit people, they would burn all the way down to the bone, that they couldn't put it out. They would put water on it, and it wouldn't do the job. And it was being used regularly enough that people actually figured out that if you got kind of damp mud, that helped at least slow it down. And so I wrote about it for Interpress Service. I reported it on Democracy Now! And that was it. The story didn't go anywhere. Nobody else touched it. There were a couple of Arab media outlets that did, but nobody in the mainstream media in the West for sure. And then it was about a year later, then Rai TV in Italy ran a documentary about illegal weapons being used in Fallujah. And that reopened the debate and caused a bit of a media whirlwind. And the Pentagon, of course, denied it. And then, of course, there's the famous quote, "Never believe anything until it's officially denied." So that really essentially opened the door. The independent newspaper in London called me and said, "Look, you broke this story. We want you to rework part of your story and run it. We're running a series because we think we got the Pentagon on this one." And so they started a series of articles. They had soldiers talking about using it in Fallujah. They found a field manual talking about using it, how it's called Whiskey Pete on the radio, and that, yeah, they used it a lot. And then essentially, and they ran my story. And then essentially they ended up forcing the Pentagon to admit that, yes, we did use this, and yes, it probably did hit civilians.
One of the reasons I wanted to ask you about Fallujah was because just a week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, I saw on ABC national television news, they had a story about Fallujah and that things were getting better there, that it was returning to normal, and that people could actually go out and sell their wares in the town square.
It's really a recycling of some propaganda that the military basically ran a small PR campaign 3-4 months ago about how life is returning to normal in Fallujah. Christian Science Monitor did a piece on it, and there was another guy. He's actually an ex-Marine fellow who wrote a piece that was surprisingly published, I believe, in I think it was by Alternet, and I might be mistaken on that, but nevertheless, it was basically a piece saying, yes, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but it's quieter here. There's not car bombs, etc. And so, actually, I have a friend in Fallujah. He lives there now. We still do stories together for Interpress Service because he's able to get around enough that we can continue to report. And he saw this type of story and said, hey, I'd like to do a story on this. And so he basically said, yes, Fallujah is quieter. It's a similar type of quiet as the quiet of death. That literally the city is dead, that today well over 50% of it remains completely destroyed. Entire neighborhoods do not have water and electricity and haven't since November 2004. He estimates that there's probably 80% unemployment in the city. Tens of thousands of refugees, even from the April '04 siege, not even talking about the November siege, are gone. They've left. Many of them have gone to Syria, never to come back again. Their homes are completely destroyed. They've lost literally everything. And so that's why it is technically, you are correct to say, yes, it's quieter in Fallujah. Another part of that is because I don't know if it's still in force. I haven't checked in about a month. I haven't asked my colleague about it. But about 4 months ago, there was a vehicle ban. It started in May. And up until at least a month ago, a vehicle ban on the entire city was in force. So literally people couldn't drive their cars anywhere. This is a city of 350,000 people. So imagine even if you just like the general downtown Seattle area, no cars allowed. So how are you going to live? What's life going to look like? How are businesses going to how are people going to shop? Where are they going to carry things? Where are they going to put them? So imagine trying to live your life in that type of environment. And of course, there's still security checkpoints and all of this, and people being harassed in the city by U.S. and Iraqi forces. So that's life in Fallujah today.
You briefly mentioned about refugees, and that seems to be the elephant in the living room that everyone here in the U.S. seems to be ignoring. Can you talk about that?
The refugee crisis in Iraq, as described by the NGO Refugees International, they describe it as it's the fastest growing refugee crisis on the planet. I've been covering it for a while now. I was over there last summer in Syria, writing about the refugees because most of them are going to Syria because up until recently, Syria was the only country on the planet that allowed Iraqis to come in without a visa. So literally, it was the only place for them to go. And at that point in May, the UNHCR was reporting 1.2 million Iraqi refugees in Syria, which is a staggeringly huge number. I mean, Syria is a country with 17 million people total. So 1.2 million. But I was there, and everyone I was talking to and everything I was seeing, it was like, that can't be right. There are refugees literally everywhere we go here. And so I talked with a woman named Sibylla Welks. She's the regional information spokesperson for UNHCR for the Middle East. And I said, look, 1.2 million, that can't be right. And she said, no, we don't think it's right either, actually. But we have to be we're always conservative in our estimates, but we can't even afford to have personnel on the border. So how would we know how many refugees are here? The Syrian government that is tracking people that come across, they're saying, and this is back in May, they're saying that there's at least 1.5 million. And at this point, there's been, even up until this day, there's between 2,000 and 3,000 people a day in Iraq becoming refugees a day. And up until very recently, up until last month, there was at least 3,000 people a day flooding across the border into Syria every single day. So we're looking at a situation now where just in Syria alone, it's likely that there's over 2 million refugees. In Jordan, official UNHCR estimates are between 750 and 850,000. Again, most people think there's well over 1 million. And then of course, if we talk about Lebanon and Iran and other Gulf states and start to add it up, along with the few folks that have gotten asylum in European countries, we're looking at people inside the country, the numbers pushing 3 million now of internally displaced Iraqis. And then people that have left the country altogether, I think it's safe to say it's probably 3 million as well. And then in addition to that, to give you an idea of just the scope of the catastrophe that the occupation has become. So we have 6 million people that are refugees. And this was a country that had 27 million population when the invasion was launched. It's now down to under 24 million. That's because 3 million people have fled the country altogether. The most recent Lancet report published October 06, 655,000 people have been killed because of the invasion and occupation. That's 2.5% of the total population of the entire country. The group Just Foreign Policies adjusted those figures by scanning media from the date the legwork of that survey was carried out, which was July 05, and adjusted it, and they now estimate that over 1 million Iraqis have been killed. And then an Oxfam International report came out this past July, and they found that there's, in addition to the refugees, there's another 4 million Iraqis that are in dire need of emergency care. That if they don't get access to drinking water, 70% of Iraqis do not have access to safe drinking water. If they don't get access to drinking water, food, and basic medical attention, then they're literally at risk for their lives. So when we add all of that up, we have now over half the total population of the country are either refugees in dire need of emergency care, wounded, or dead.
Speaking of water, you had covered on one of your previous trips, you followed one of the Bechtel projects, I know, and talked about how in a particular town, the pipe came into a deep hole, and that was their source of water when it was turned on for an hour or two a day. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, it was back in January 04. I did a report for Public Citizen on Bechtel's failure to withhold their contractual obligations to do reconstruction and rehabilitation of the water systems in Iraq. And basically, we saw down in some cities, Hilla Najaf and Diwaniyah, south of Baghdad, that already there were waterborne diseases, kidney stones, diarrhea, nausea, because most people there, even in big cities like Najaf, half the people, even according to the engineers at the water treatment plant, didn't have access to drinking water. And this is back in January 04, so naturally today, then when we look at the more recent Oxfam International figures, 70% of the people in the whole country don't have access to safe drinking water. It's clear. I mean, that's actually not a surprise to me at all. Actually, I think that figure is probably a bit low, because already what I was seeing back in January 04 was indications that probably half the country, everywhere I went, there was entire villages, sometimes even cities then, that didn't have access to water.
Well, speaking of figures that are low, we just see in the corporate media reports that this last month of October, U.S. casualty rates have been the lowest since, I think, March of last year. What do you attribute that to?
That is a direct correlation to the amount of air power that's being used in Iraq. I'm going to be very conservative in the estimates. I'm going to go with the most conservative one I've seen. And it's that in the first 7 months of this year, there were more combat air missions flown in Iraq. There were 3 times more combat air missions flown in Iraq than the previous 3 years combined. That is an enormous increase in the use of air power and bombs and civilian casualties, etc. And they're doing that because they've basically lost control of the ground. They basically handed Al-Anbar province, which is 1/3 the geographic area of the country. They've handed that over to Sunni militias. They've armed them, they're funding them, they know they're being attacked by some of them at night, but that way they can keep more of their troops off the ground. And that's why the casualties for U.S. troops, for now, is lower. But I would expect that to increase because basically what we're seeing, along with what they've done in Al-Anbar and this huge uptick, in air power, they're setting the stage for something akin to what happened in Fallujah, because after the U.S. couldn't control the city in April '04, they did the same thing. They armed people in the city. They gave them money. They paid them. They put them on the payroll. They gave them ammunition. They gave them walkie-talkies and cars, etc., and said, okay, we're turning security over to you. And then 6 months later, they had to go back in and attack the entire city. And I think that that's the plan, that essentially that's what they're doing in Anbar, where they're basically arming and backing the Sunnis in Al-Anbar while supporting the Shia politically in the government. And again, that's one of the key reasons why there's so much sectarian violence.
Well, that then goes to the recent reports going back a couple months about different local heads of different factions and militias siding with the U.S. And by appearances in corporate media, you get the impression that they agree with the direction the U.S. is taking in Iraq, but it sounds like they're actually being paid to join forces.
They're making a lot of money off of this, and the people, basically anyone now in Iraq that is collaborating with the occupation authorities in any way is signing a death sentence, or at least signing a sentence that they're never going to walk down a street in Iraq and be safe again. I'll give you an example of this. There was this tribal sheikh in Ramadi, had a very bad reputation in the province, known as a thief. Basically, his tribe, he was sheikh of a tribe that was accused often of doing things like scouting out parts of the highway from Amman into Baghdad and looting cars and pulling over cars and basically just being thieves. And this man, known as Abu Risha, was touted. He was held up by Bush when Bush flew over to Al-Anbar to the military base a little ways back. He met with this guy, Abu Risha, and said, this is the future of Iraq. This man, this great man, is this freedom fighter, is why Al-Anbar is doing so much better. And this is, we are bringing democracy to Iraq. And then Bush leaves, and a week later, Abu Risha is killed at his home in Ramadi, the capital city of Al-Anbar province. And then so now it's either one of his brothers or his sons is now basically stepped into that position. It's because it's very lucrative. He was being paid millions and millions and millions of dollars. He kind of had this false power position, and now he's dead, and that is consistently what's happening. If we look at Diyala province last week, there was 10 sheikhs that were collaborating. They were meeting with the Americans, and they were saying, yes, you can pay us, we'll help try to bring security to Diyala province. They left that meeting, and all 10 of them were kidnapped. So this is basically how the U.S. plans are going right now.
You'd written recently about a concept called search and avoid. Can you talk about that? And has that been contributing any to the reduction in losses by U.S. troops?
Search and avoid missions, the term I got from interviewing, I got that from interviewing some active duty Iraq veterans that I saw earlier on my tour up in upstate New York at Fort Drum, actually. And I talked to this one fellow, and his name is Eli Wright, and he told me that basically he had been in Iraq a couple of years ago in a very volatile area. He was in like the Ramadi area, and he said, we were getting blown up so much and sent out on these BS patrols that we all knew that our commander was basically just sending us out so he could get medals, because even if he's not with the platoon, when they're out doing a patrol and they get attacked and they're in combat, he gets a combat medal. And so we all knew he was doing that, and we were getting hit so hard, so frequently, that we said, you know what, this doesn't make sense. And so he said, we started going out to the end of our patrol route, finding a nice big field and parking our Humvees, which didn't have armor, and sitting there and smoking cigarettes and drinking soda and listening to music and pretending. And he said every hour we were required to call in and check in with base. And we'd call in every hour and say, yeah, we're still checking this field for weapons caches. It's going great. And then they'd hang out, and then they'd go back home. And he said, yeah, we were doing that just about every other day. And everyone we knew that could get away with it was doing it. And then I interviewed another active duty Iraq veteran that said, yeah, we were doing the same thing. And he was there a year ago in a totally different part of the country. And he said it was rampant. We were doing it too. And then I interviewed several other guys, and they were all saying the same thing. So my point is, while there's not deliberate, obvious disobeying of orders being done, like people literally refusing orders, but orders are absolutely being disobeyed. We've got a very huge amount of GI resistance now happening on the ground in Iraq. Right now, I got an email from a soldier 2 days ago saying, oh, yeah, we're doing this right now. You bet. We're just trying to stay alive. So that certainly is another reason why there's fewer American casualties, because another one of them said, yeah, we'll go into a field and Iraqi kids come up and try to sell us sodas and things, and we'll buy the sodas and then tell them to go tell anyone in the area that might attack us, say, look, we're here. We don't want to fight. Just please tell them just to leave us alone.
Only a couple minutes left. What final thoughts would you like to leave with listeners?
Well, it's a horribly depressing situation in Iraq, and I think as catastrophic as it is, and how much trouble our country's in right now, I think that there are some signs of hope. And one of the things that I think is very important that people are aware of is a group called Iraq Veterans Against the War. If we look at the history of the Vietnam War, I think aside from the Vietnamese resistance, one of the key elements of ending that war was a very healthy, strong, robust GI resistance, that by the end of Vietnam, half the troops on the ground wouldn't fight. And so if you have a military that is that broken, you can't continue to fight. And that's starting to happen now in Iraq. Iraq Veterans Against the War is getting between 10 and 15 new members a week. The fastest growing segment of their population are active duty soldiers. They're trying to get people in Iraq to join up, and they're being successful. And this is an organization that is doubled in size. It's still relatively small, but they've doubled in size every year since they began. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. And I think that that's a very tangible thing that people who are upset about this, that want something to do, you can go to ivaw.org and just send them an email and ask what you can do to help out.
Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
Thanks again for having me.